Uh, Thank you, Professor Uygur. I would like to introduce you the chair of this session. Sevtap Metin is an associate professor of the philosophy of law at Istanbul University. She obtained her undergraduate and postgraduate degrees from the same university. Her research areas include biomedical ethics and law, law and film, and methodology of law. Professor Metin, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, dear Özge. After I have been introduced by dear Özge, I have introduced the first participating to start a meeting. Mr. Zhang from USA, is he ready?
Hi, can you hear me?
Yeah, yes, we can hear you very well. Hi, first of all, hello, my dear colleagues and all audience. I'm very pleasure to introduce Mr. Zhang. I hope pronounce your name properly, Mr. Zhang.
Sure. So can you hear me? And can I share my screen because I've prepared a PowerPoint for the presentation?
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yes.
Let
I
me,
think Miss Professor Uygur solved.
Yes, he can do. He can do.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay. Mr. Zhang's speech, title of Mr. Zhang's speech is Value, Reason and Partiality, Associative Obligation in the Political Community. Yes, we are very pleasure to hear you, Mr. Zhang.
thank you. But just from my screen, I was told that I'm not allowed to share my screen. I'm not so sure how can I share the PowerPoint to the audience.
Please
No.
wait a minute.
It will be
Maybe,
allowed. It will be allowed for a minute.
Yeah.
because I'm only a participant, maybe you can just, oh, I see, maybe it works for now.
Now you accessible.
Yeah, it's ready, I think. We are able to see your PowerPoint, Mr. Zhang.
So, does it work for now?
Yeah, yes.
Okay, thank
We
you
have
so much.
seen.
Okay, thank you. Thank you so much. My name is Zhang. I'm a GST candidate at NYU School of Law. And I'm very pleased to have the opportunity to present part of my GST dissertation in today's webinar. For this presentation titled Value, Reason, and Partiality, Associative Obligation in the Political Community, I would like to divide it into 3 parts. So first, I would like to give a very general analysis of the associative obligation. And second, I want to narrow down the scope of discussion into the associative obligation in the political community. And third, I would like to provide a potential justificatory account along the line of value, reason, and partiality. So while we are talking about the obligation, and particularly the associative obligation as indicated by the theme of our conference, the philosophy of law in times of crisis. So we know that we live in the age of rights, obsessed with the right talk. Based on the fundamental idea of universal human rights, individuals are defined as autonomous with human dignity, interrelated with others to form the society, and further protected against the arbitrary power by the state. Besides, it's also an age of obligations that we live in as well, especially in this kind of the times of crisis. People have obligations toward different targets in various forms and of distinctive nature. So as of the relationship between the right and obligation, I would like to argue that obligations do not merely correlate to corresponding rights in a secondary or derivative manner. In some circumstances, obligations would also replicate themselves by virtue of corresponding rights in a reciprocal manner, so that one's obligations to the other may well legitimize or even demands towards the latter. Further to this, obligations are independent as of its role in protecting and promoting rights, and may be essential to the existence of valuable activities and relationships to constitute a central role in our understanding of moral and political life. So along this way, after my elaborations about the significance of the obligation, I would like to put forward numerous forms of obligation by distinct source, nature, and justification. Not all of them are in accordance with those highly universal moral theories, like the consequentialism or the Kantian theories, with an embodiment of the virtue of impartiality. If we take a closer look at the way those obligations are derived, manifested, and undertaken, it is more than clear that not all subjects are morally or legally obligated in a general or universal manner, by excluding distinctions among those to which the subject is bound itself by a moral, social, or legal tie. And in particularly, obligations by this nature are actually derived from various forms of specific, partial, and affiliated associations, where a variety of agent-relative phrases like roles, relationships, and memberships abound by their respective stance, position, and allegiance. Those agent-relative reasons as embodied in associations may not only frame the delicate fabric of human interactions, of our common expressions and daily lives. Further to this, they may also define our moral standings, judgments, and actions to shape our core identity as human beings. For example, we can just think about the coronavirus and the pandemic or the post-pandemic era. Does it make sense to aspire for us to obey the social distancing rules? For example, wearing masks or taking the vaccination? Why are we supposed to be obligated towards our roommates or neighbors with whom we may only happen to live together or nearby by complying with the strictest standard of the sanitation, regardless of possibly opposite inclination as of risk appetite or risk aversion? And even back to the last March, we know the Black Lives Matter movement in the United States. Now, why are we supposed to have the obligation to go beyond our way to care about, fight with, or even sacrifice for oneself we may never meet or even know about, merely by virtue of that he or she is our fellow citizen, but nonetheless sharing possibly different colors, regions, religious backgrounds, and standpoints along the spectrum of ideology? So those examples just present this issue not only with the theoretical value about what and why we have associative obligation, but also a lot of the practical implications. So in this presentation, first, I would like to provide a general analysis of the associative obligation. So I would like to give the conception as I understand what associative obligation denotes. So as far as I'm concerned, the associative obligation is one subset of special obligation and moral obligation by virtue of the moral odds and norms and normative commitments towards our intimates and associates based on associations as of the roles, relationships, and memberships that we were mostly born into or happen to rise into and communally share with other members in our community. To put it in a more simple way, associative obligation is special obligation with association-based grounds by virtue of moral odds and normative commitments from the perspective of practical reasoning. So as for its nature, I argue three aspects of the associative obligation. It is special obligation, moral obligation, and the prima facie obligation. By arguing for the special obligation, as I said, there are lots of the agent relative reasons with the association-based grounds compared with other kinds of obligation, for example, your general obligation to obey the law. And it is also arguably the moral obligation, even there are some of the non or moral neutral characters embedded in associations. And it is also the prima facie obligation compared with those all things considered one. For example, the obligation derived from the consequentialism, that we may weigh different kinds of obligation, especially when they are in conflict. So in this chart, we can see more clearly that when moral obligations embedded with the moral odds are derived or oriented towards special targets, especially by virtue of the association-based reasons, it then becomes associative obligation. And as of the scope of discussion in my paper and also my project, when we are talking about the associative obligation in political communities, they are virtually the associative political obligation or political associative obligation. So when we talk about associative obligation, we cannot ignore the characters of association in which we are obliged to one another by virtue of the role, relationships, and memberships. Here, I just put forward 5 characters of association so that we may have a better understanding of what do we mean by association. Those are absolutely not exhausted of all characters, but I believe that with all of them, we can have a better understanding of what associations are as the paradigm case in our daily life. I argue that the contingency explains the formation of an association as of its constituents. The persistency reviews the status of an association along the temporal dimension. And the non-involuntariness, which basically argue that it is not totally voluntary, nor totally involuntary, somewhere in between, illustrating the way how one enters into or exists from an association. And also the open-endedness defines the scope and content of the associative obligation, which are not always that clear. We can have some of the constructive interpretation as of the content and the scope of what we own to our fellow citizens. And also one last but not the least, partiality, which shapes various forms of association full of agent relative reasons through which subjects are interrelated with one another. So second part of the presentation, I would like to further narrow down our discussion into the realm of political community. To begin with, there might be some methodological dilemma because when we're talking about associations or associative obligation, that might be too general as a general interpretive social practice. People may be worrying about which particular kind of association or which particular type of associative obligation you are referring to, or you are going to give a interpretive concept such as, for example, an association as such or an associative obligation as such. In this way, I provide a paradigm with the 2 dimensions, one evaluative one and another descriptive one. So as you can see in this chart, and which was accompanied by those 2 dimensions, along the horizontal one, I would argue that is the evaluative one from the degree of non-involuntariness. That is, people who are entering into the association or exist from the association in a more involuntary manner or more voluntary manner. For example, families, religious groups, those are more involuntary. But for the friendships and intimate relationships, that are obviously more voluntary. So the way how one enters into or exists from the association can be shown in this evaluative dimension. And more importantly, it provides a criteria, a parameter and a reference much more explicit than other counterparts, as you remember those 5 characters of association as I explained. And this single character, namely the degree of non-involuntariness not only reveals itself as to how one enters into or exists from an association, but also reflects how other characters of association, those other four characters, work together in defining associations being such a general interpretive social practice. And also I give a descriptive dimension, as you can see in the vertical line, from the small scale to the large scale. We have very small scale as of the association, for example, 2 or 3 people, intimate relationships, your significant partner, families, and your friends. And also we have associations of large scale, consisting of millions or even billions of people. For example, political communities, religious groups, and ethnic groups. Based on this descriptive dimension, we can see numbers. And in this way, the character of partiality, the associational bonds, could also be manifested from the small scale to the large scale. That is how familiar you are with those people, to what extent your association bonds are strong or weak. So beyond this methodological dilemma, I would like to provide more discussion that why I would like to narrow down my discussion, the scope of discussion, into the political community. First, we know that political community constitutes the paradigm among various forms of association by virtue of the both dimensions. As you can see, that is in the center, in the middle. Either you argue from the vertical one, from the large scale to the small scale, or from the evaluative one, from the involuntary side to the voluntary side. And more importantly, political community, with the efforts by lots of the legal theorists and the political theorists, is in one way more precisely defined than other associations upon further elaborations as of both its conception and virtues. And in particular, I want to emphasize that both in this paper and later chapters of my dissertation, when I'm talking about the political community, the working conception for me is an inclusive one based on the legal pluralism. Namely, I want to include minorities, immigrants, even the exiled or the dual allegiance, people who have dual citizenship, or the so-called non-standard memberships into the picture. So those are not only the concrete one based on the state or the rule of law, but those non-standard members would be also included in my discussion of the political community, where associative obligation could be derived. So here I provide a working conception of the political community, that is an association that seeks to establish and exert political authority by a political institution. But I would like to work more on this definition to fit my elaborations of the associative obligation in the political community. Even within the political community, we can also see different types of associative obligation, among which 2 of them are most salient. One is, as I defined, associative political obligation, APO. That is, with lots of the literature from the legal theory and political theory arguing for why we have the moral duty to obey the law of one's political community. I call it APO. And another one, which might be of more interest to me, PAO, the political associative obligation, is denoted as what individuals in the political community owe to other fellow members by virtue of those agent relative reasons embodied upon association-based grounds, even without the obedience or with the absence of the obedience. So those 2 types of associative obligation in the political community have lots of similarities. For example, they are both grounded in the context of the political community in terms of the characters, value, and essence, and also both manifesting the most salient features of what associative obligation in the political community could be, and constitute the paradigm cases respectively. And also what we are carrying out more is about the prescriptive L2 rather than the descriptive is in our following discussions. However, there are lots of the distinctions in between. For example, the APO might be more vertical side against the authority, the sovereign, what we own to the sovereignty, or why should we obey the law of our own political community. But the PAO is more horizontal by virtue of those association-based grounds. And the first APO is grounded by the monopoly of coercive power by the state in an authoritative, coercive, and exclusive manner. But the latter one might be based on a value-laden special relationships. The content of them might be also different. For the first one, it basically consists of the moral duty to obey the law of one's political community. But for the latter one, what we are more interested in is what individuals in the political community owe to other fellow members. So by comparing the APO and the PAO, both by virtue of their similarities and distinctions, we can find some connections underlying those two conceptions. So if we take an involving point of view, the PAO, the political social obligation, shall be logically and practically parallel to the APO, because we first have the community with our fellow citizens, and then we may have the political institution with the political authority. And even if we recall the Ronald Dworkin's methodology of the personification that personified the state as one individual member of the political community, we can find that the APO would thus only constitute one species of the PAO, just like another individual member of the political community. So having argued so far, we may still find some of puzzles here. For example, the current scholarship is fairly unbalanced between two accounts, with tireless arguments for the APO but mysterious ignorance of the PAO. And here is just where my research question put forward. And that is, what and why we owe to our fellow members just by virtue of those various forms of association. Maybe two qualifiers here to narrow down the scope of my discussion. First is the political obligation, the political community, especially the PAO. That is, I would particularly tackling the associative obligation in the community account by further exploring whether, why, and what individuals in the political community owe to their fellow members with the association-based grounds with the absence of obedience in a horizontal manner. And the second qualifier is from which perspective. In my project, and also as manifested in this paper, I would like to, from the perspective of the practical reasoning, that is seeking for justificatory grounds for associative obligation by further exploring how those agent relative reasons as embodied in associative obligation could be particularly tackled and reasonably accommodated. So in the third and also the last part of my presentation, I would want to provide a potential argument, a justificatory account for associative obligation in the political community along the line of value, reason, and partiality. So as a very brief forecast, we know there are lots of the grounds, potential grounds for associative obligation, but most of them would nonetheless fail. For example, the consequentialism, the natural duties, or even the voluntarism justificatory accounts. Due to the limit of the time, I won't go into much details about each of them. And what I'm more interested in and also found more promising is the fourth one, that is the partiality. So partiality can also be divided into two parts. First is the horizontal one, that is the relationship-based partiality. And second is the vertical one, that is the membership-based partiality. When we are talking about the relationship-based partiality, we are more interested in the value-laden special relationships, which are conceptually conceived as relationships developed towards particular groups of people with non-instrumental values, such as respect, attachment, and support, as well as solidarity, loyalty, and commitment. Here is one well-argued articulation by Professor Samuel Schaffler, arguing that to value one's relationship with another person non-instrumentally is arguably to see that person's needs, interests, and desires embodied in those value-laden special relationships as providing one with reasons for action in an exclusive and prioritized manner within a realm that may vary depending on the nature of those relationships. But I don't think that is adequate. Or to put it in another way, why value one's relationship? is even those value-laden special relationships can provide us with such reasons. And even if we are provided with such reasons, how can that reason be an obligatory one? That is, being by virtue of obligation rather than mere reasons for action. And for the vertical dimension, the membership-based partiality, we can also think of the role-based group memberships, which are basically referred to the social roles each individual member constitutes and occupies, which would further shape his or her identity with the community. But why is the group's norms or ideals in parallel to one's needs, interests, and desires, as we discussed previously, can provide us with reasons to comply with? And also for the similar question, even we have such reasons, why those reasons might be in an obligatory manner? So those two dimensions are something I'm going to further pursue under the potential ground of partiality for associative obligation. So due to the time of the presentation, I may only give you a very brief forecast of my basic argument in the in this realm, that is along the line of the value reason partiality. First, I would provide a phenomenological exploration of value. What do we mean by value? How valuing is distinctive from, for example, desiring and caring? And what about the emotive aspect, those emotional vulnerability as embodied in valuing, in the action of value? And second, even if, for example, things we are talking about the value reason nexus. So what on earth is the relationship between value and reason? Are we committed to the view that it is the reason-based account of value, for example, as argued by T.M. Scallon, or the opposite end, it is the value or being valuable that provides us with reasons for action? Then some of the perplexities between the valuing and being valuable deserve more scrutiny. For example, when Schaffer talking about valuing special relationships, it is because of special relationship itself are valuable, or only by we valuing it can we argue that those special relationships being valuable for the providing us with reasons. And in particular, since the partiality is the commonality embodied in both the special relationships on the horizontal one and the membership on the vertical one, the morality of partiality may provide us with more elements and nutrients to understand the reason-giving manner or the reason-giving property by the partiality as embedded in those associations. So that might be one potential justificatory account I'm still working on to try to justify the associative obligation in the political community. So that might be the basic contents of my presentation, and I'm looking forward to any of your comments or further discussions. Thank you.
We also thanks to you, Mr. Zhang, for your very detailed explanation presentation. Thanks a lot. It's very highly elaborative presentation. And then, if you wish, we continue by second present participants, our participants. I want to leave the turn to him, Mr. Orkun Yılmaz.
Yes, I'm here.
Yeah, Orkun Yılmaz, his speech is mainly about political action and political sphere, as I understood. And his paper's title is Might the Debate Between Schmitt and Habermas on Political Sphere, Outdated in Contemporary Era. First, could you please introduce yourself a little bit, because I'm sorry, but I couldn't find good information about you by internet or something else. It confused me.
Okay, and my name is Hello, everyone, with best regards. Firstly, my name is Orkun Yılmaz, and I am a master's student at Istanbul Technical University in political studies. So today, if I can share my screen, it would be my pleasure to you.
Yeah, it will be ready for a minute.
Okay, I do.
Mhm. Okay, we have seen.
Is everyone
Okay.
is seeing this full screen? Okay. And I'm starting with the a paper is transformed into the presentation. Which is called the debate between Jürgen Habermas and a German philosopher and Schmitt, again the German philosopher, on political spheres might be outdated in the contemporary era. And contemporary era here is the comply with the topic of today's seminar as well, the time of crisis and political and the subtitle to be more explanatory, to make it more explanatory. Political space narrow the possibility of political action as the political spheres expand. And as an introduction as well, this will be the content I will follow. Briefly about the parts. The first part of the presentation is to explicate the meaning of conceptualization of relevant terms like political spheres, action, or etc. The second part is to express the theoretical root of the debate between Habermas and Schmitt. And the third part, it aims for understanding at which points the two Greek names are diversified. And the last part rests on how this debate could have some voices for us, the people who lives in the contemporary era, in the time of crisis. And the main thesis of my presentation is to show that the prescriptive order of the political sphere can only be established by the determination of unregulated political action. And I assume that it would be better to keep that main thesis during the presentation, because I will try to convince you about it. And this is the argument I will follow in the analytical perspective. I applied the modus tollens there, and as you see, this that C there, it's called. Is named, labeled like there's a correlation between political space and political action. And PC means that a political sphere, and PE means that a political action there. As a conventional idea, mostly accepted idea, the more regulated political sphere, the more regulated political action, sorry. And as I said, I applied the modus tollens there. I will give it's not like this, and then conclusion is not like that. About the definitions, firstly, the public sphere. The public sphere is generally conceived as a social space in which different opinions are expressed, problems of general concern are discussed, and collective solutions are developed communicatively. This is the definition of public sphere for me. However, as you know, that is an important feature, like in this area, there is no formality here. And for political sphere versus public sphere, the political sphere is a sub-sphere of public sphere, next to the moral economic spheres. Moreover, the possibility of domination on one sphere to another is what we see in contemporary era of public sphere, but not in political sphere as much. And not what I'm trying to separate at this point, that political sphere and the public sphere should not be treated as equals. Like political sphere has evolved for ages without admitting to interconnectedness between moral and economic sphere. Yeah, they are influenced by them, but they still keep as an area of separated. And according to Ulus Bakar, one of the great Turkish philosopher, the political sphere is a diagram, connected by infinite lines on the plane of ideals, providing numerous possibilities for action on reality. And the last relevant term for presentation is a political action. And political action, what it means for me is like substantially included in political sphere, but it is also distinct concept. There is a potential political action. In lexicon, the meaning of it, such as political action, is designed to attain a purpose by the use of political power or by activity in political channels. And as we come back to that point, there is a contrast between political sphere and the political action, as I said. And that contrast comes from the fact that why a political sphere is regular and formal, the political action is irregular and formless. In more detail, through opinions like convictions, polls, elections, and referendums, we are facing with the facts of the political sphere with its increasing density day by day. On the other hand, legitimate protest, especially for group rights or emergence of environmental issues and even acts of terror, attributes to the formulas of political actions. Moreover, within the history as revolutionary sense, we know that the political spheres could be even blocked for political actions by a broad reading from ancient Greek to modern Europe, especially in the time of crisis. However, someone here would rightly claim the haziness of these distinctions between political sphere and political action, that is because blurring somehow. But that is where the debate also occurs between Habermas and Schmitt. However, before passing to debate, I would like to mention the source of theoretical conflict between them, the impossibility of pure transfer. The impossibility of pure transfer is that innocence of society, as I accepted in my paper. At the beginning, then, couldn't be transferred to rationality of society, which corresponds to the legitimation of sovereignty with laws within ambiguity of society itself. If we are approaching the former or regularity in political sphere, which is its structure, the problem of legitimation arises up. Innocence, one of the concepts for this legitimation, is needed. Where the innocence of society comes from? According to Wurzbacher again, the historical roots of the innocence of the people are based on the right of the people to be safe, like in Hobbesian reading. And moreover, the requirement of society, sorry about it, like about the second element, I should, okay, that is no problem there. Moreover, the requirement of society safety could be regarded as the first moment of social contract. It shouldn't necessarily be on rational consensus. Then what the legitimation of ambiguity of society is made by laws. However, it's like you cannot choose your neighbor on rational accounts. What is the legitimation of that part sovereign who decides to that laws, rational laws? For Schmitt, the sovereign is he who decides on the exception. In particular, Schmitt delegate his representation of rationality to legislation and delegated his irrationality to the execution. And for Schmitt, it's clear that those who will not be invited to the fight of politics are certain. It is the masses with the potential, which has potential for revolutionary account. And as I assert in my paper presentation, formality has no business with formal masses. And the third part, as a summary of the third part of the paper, is the claim that while Schmitt found the existentiality of the state at the roots of irrational needs within the framework of homogeneity and historical preliminaries of society, but Habermas does that at the rationality within the level of normativity on individuals. According to Schmitt, the people are a mass which owns a homogeneous and historical premise. In this sense, it has no normative rational content. Therefore, a state of law cannot be established through public debates. And here, Habermas says that Schmitt makes a strict distinction, as a quite, between the legal and political components of the constitution, and it treats the nation as a hinge between the traditional principles of bourgeoisie constitutional state and democratic principle of the self-determination of people. Therefore, Schmitt provides the right of people to self-determination, autonomy, thanks to the laws. For Schmitt, democracy is meaningless if national homogeneity does not exist. The reason why Habermas and Schmitt are confronted is, in my opinion, is quite clear, because Schmitt does not see individuals as Habermas does see, an individual with normative level. What it means that, in a broader sense, for Habermas, states no longer have the principle of effectiveness due to their national identity, and every new government established will increase its legitimacy if it consolidates it inside and outside. And another distinction about them is that homogeneity for Schmitt is national, whereas for Habermas, homogeneity is international in the sense of humanity. Simply put, on the one side, discursive, reasoned republic. On the other side, communitarian nation having common consciousness. As a concluding remarks here, maybe it would be appreciated that analogy. Schmitt is, for me, as a past treasure, Habermas is a future envisioner. While he seeks his mind in the process of political will, adopted by citizens of associated people. And in the last part, the people argued that this debate on modern state theories, namely, could not recognize the interweaving of the distinction between political action and political sphere by increasing institutionalization. We all know that human beings have been struggling for survival for 20 decades. They have invaded the areas of which can be named stabilized, at least, no matter what the character of this area has. That struggle has transformed the place stabilized into the non-stabilized places as infinite loom and no opportunity for otherwise. For Habermas, it looks the only condition for saving this struggle in this direction, which is the infinite loom, is to save a man in manner of emancipation interests, to make all human beings rational for ideal speech. If I understood correct, it ties up with the logic of universal equality, which tells us the only alternative you have if you ride this horse, you can reach the point of somewhere, more or less stabilized. At least you can say you have tried. I think it is very away from understanding what Schmitt says on political sphere. However, Schmitt also about our standing on the rule of law comes from homogeneity. We cannot mention any determinant situation in law since we know how stable it is. There will be an increase in number of regulations and also correspondingly arbitrariness. Statistical information can be used as empirical evidence here, but I didn't use. But I'm sure that we can find numerous empirical evidence that like a correlation between arbitrariness and the regulation of a number of the regulation in the laws. To understand the problem here, increasingly institutionalized political action in the sense of the will of the people formed the political sphere. However, then this political sphere created an artificial but highly rational sovereignty. This created political action under the name of sovereign, mostly in democracy. It was not a political action that could contain will of people, and so political action and sphere intervened and begin to interlock together. And in conclusion, the prescriptive order of the political sphere can be established only by the determination of unregulated political action. It should have been proposed that reformulates today political sphere as a sphere of accidents, events, flows, interactions, fluctuations of public opinion, revelations, and fights. Back to the question of who sovereign is that the sovereign is the one who can express his or her own dream alive with soundness in the community. One should politicize herself that fragile existence of heard derelict, and that even its own fragility cannot be posed. It should be not accept being forced to play innocent role continuously in the society. The tendency and courage to commit an offense against sovereign is the strongest possibility of political action, despite the expanding mentioned political spheres. They are my references I used in the paper. Thank you for listening, and all questions are welcome. And thank you for also the organizers to host me. Thank you.
Thanks to Mr. Yılmaz. Your presentation is highly successful to make distinct between political action and political sphere. And I think it will be better to collect the questions, all the questions, to all participants in the end of the presentation. We would like to keep up speeches. And our third guest is from Singapore, Miss Seow-Hon. Hello, Miss Hon. It seems to me that Ms. Hantan's speech has highly interesting substantive critiques based on legal philosophy related to legislative order of COVID-19. Her title is called Legislating and Enforcing for Containment in a Pandemic, Jurisprudential Issues raised in Singapore's COVID laws. Ms. Hontan, yes, could you please, before starting your speech, I wish present yourself, introduce yourself shortly.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm very glad to be speaking from Singapore. My name is Seow-Hon Tan. Seow-Hon is my first name, and I'm an associate professor at the Singapore Management University School of Law. So I hope that all of you can see my slides.
Yeah, yes.
Okay, so I'm speaking on this topic, legislating and enforcing for containment in a pandemic. And I've written this paper, and it's actually published as part of an ebook effort by my department. And we were writing, all of us were contributing chapters, and many of us were contributing chapters on the COVID. So I thought it's interesting to share, even though it's a published paper, because I mean, it's part of our solidarity as a global community to be able to talk about what's happening in our country. Now, I'll give you some context of, in case many of you are not familiar with Singapore, I'll give you some context, okay, of the country before I go into the jurisprudential issues. So we are dealing with a population of less than 6 million people in a densely populated island city-state. Our landmass is very, very small. The longest from end to end of Singapore for the longer section is 50 kilometers, and end to end on the shorter section is just 27 kilometers. So we're talking about a very densely populated city. So before the COVID, of course, our airport was a very busy airport. We were quite a hub for international travel connections, and we also have a busy port. We are also heavily reliant on foreign workers, migrant workers for certain services, such as essential services, such as cleaning services, construction, and so on. So many of them are housed in dormitories, and this turned out to be quite a significant hotspot for the spread of COVID. That was at the start, in the first few months of COVID. Our current figures for COVID actually stand at less than 61,000 persons infected. I mean, most of them have recovered already, so very, very few are still infected. And many of these infections were actually chalked up in the first few months of COVID, and mainly in the dormitories. The number of deaths in this whole period is actually about 30. So that's a very, very small number, thankfully. So the most drastic measures implemented by the Singapore government were actually implemented in April to June in last year. And when the measures were implemented, the government called it a circuit breaker. It was an attempt to really break the transmission of the infection. And the schools went mostly online. We were supposed to stay at home. There was no visiting of others. There was no social gathering. You could only take out food. You can't be eating in the restaurants. And mask wearing was made mandatory. So I want to say also that we actually have no culture of mask wearing, unlike, say, Japan, even though Singapore is known to be a very clean city. But I think one of the things that helps make a difference is culturally, we are very willing to take the cue from this government instructions, and we are willing to cooperate and just wear masks. So we don't really discourse too much about our personal rights and so on in relation to mask wearing. Okay, so I'll say a little more about this in a while. Now, I think that there are some interesting, unique factors to mention about regulating in a pandemic. And one of them is that, of course, there is emerging knowledge as to how the infection, how the virus spreads, and it's very fast developing. Now, the second unique factor is that to regulate, to contain the pandemic, there needs to be massive regulation across many, many areas. And I think the third unique factor is that these regulations would, of course, interfere and disrupt our day-to-day activities that we actually take for granted. I mean, we don't really think about sitting close to a person, just hanging out with people and so on. But now all these is disrupted. The fourth factor is that if we were to violate these regulations, most of us would not feel that we are doing something terribly evil, right? I mean, we're just not wearing a mask. We may assess the risk differently. So it doesn't involve something evil such as beating someone up. So in that sense, it's really concerns behavior that we take for granted, and maybe we don't assess the risk the same way. So I think that these special factors need to be taken into account when we're thinking about regulation. So the other point about regulation is, of course, that we can't wait for common law to evolve. So you need a quick legislation, and not just through statutes, because Parliament then has to sit and pass the statutes, but because the many amendments may be needed. So we need actually subsidiary legislation. The minister needs to be authorized to quickly change the laws. And this is not just about how the knowledge of how the disease is spread is emerging, but also because we can't predict how people will actually respond to the laws. So one of the things that happened was that when people were allowed to exercise, to go out of the house only to exercise and to buy groceries for essential services, it turns out that all the Singaporeans just went out to exercise, so we ended up crowding the parks and so on. So then certain measures had to be taken. The car parks of the parks were actually closed, so that you're forced actually to go to the park nearer your house. You can't drive to a park further away, a popular one, a nice beach or something like that. Okay, so it's to limit the numbers. So because these measures have to be quickly changed, then I guess it has to be done through subsidiary legislation rather than to wait for Parliament to sit. Now, the other thing, so I'm going to look at these issues through, I think there are four jurisprudential themes that are raised, four theories that are relevant. So I'll talk about them. So I'll be talking about how Dworkin suggests that there should be principled consistency across different areas of law. I'm going to be talking about Fuller's requirements of the inner morality of law, the rule of law. Then I'm going to be talking about legal positivism's focus on how there should be sanctions accompanying the law, and how effective sanctions are very important where lawmaking is concerned. And finally, I'm going to talk about how Dworkin suggests that we interpret the law, Dworkin's method of interpretation of law, which is different from American legal realism. Okay, so first, in relation to Dworkin's idea of how there should be principled consistency across the law. As some of you may be familiar with Dworkin, Dworkin is suggesting that law is a seamless web, and we expect that like cases are to be treated alike. We expect that there should be no checkerboard statutes, so law should make sense across the board. There should be similar underlying themes or principles on which the law is based. Now, one of the ways that we regulated to contain the pandemic was to say that only essential services could be offered during those lockdown period, the circuit breaker period of a few months. And then the government had to determine what constituted an essential service. So some of it became kind of criticized, okay, because so one thing that is easy to understand is how, you know, the necessary operations, medical operations, the surgeries have to go on. But if it's an elective surgery, something that can wait, of course, we understand that, you know, during the lockdown, you're not supposed to do that. So that can be understood. But the amount of detail that had to be looked into was kind of funny. So I have a dog at home, and you know, for vet services, the vet services could actually run, but only if it was urgent, the animal was suffering from something urgent. So as a result, nail clipping of the animal wasn't allowed. Some vet services actually offer nail clipping. And so the vet, I had a dialogue with the vet, and the vet was saying, yeah, she understands that actually nail clipping can be quite essential, because if the nails of the dogs grow too long, you know, it can actually injure themselves. It causes pain when they run. So, you know, there's some debate about whether, you know, it's really essential or not. Then the other thing that people were challenging was at first it was decided that psychologists could not see their patients in person. So that was disputed because mental health is essential, right? I mean, you can't, if you see your psychologist over Zoom, it's just not the same as meeting in person. So it may not be helpful. So eventually that was revised. Now, what was funny was that during the same time, hairdressing salons could offer haircuts. So people started joking that, you know, haircuts are more essential than mental health. So that cannot be the case. And then the details are really quite funny, because at first food was allowed to be sold, but I mean, there were drinks, shops that sold only drinks. So one drink that is very popular is the boba tea. I don't know whether you're familiar with it. Tapioca balls. You see, it's a drink from Taiwan. So that's extremely popular with Singaporeans. So at first, the shops that were selling these Taiwanese drinks, bubble tea, were allowed to operate. But in the end, they were to be closed because there was so much criticism. And on the day that on the last day of operation during the circuit breaker, there was a long queue. Singaporeans love to queue for food, and they are food lovers. So there was a long queue. And after that, there was a kind of a little bit of a scuffle when people couldn't get in line to buy the last cup of bubble tea. And then the regulations, when they were tightened, were also quite funny in the detail. So the shops that sold more breads than cakes could open. But if you sold more cakes than breads, you know, you had to close. So it's such fine detail that the government went into. But you can see that there is an effort really to ensure that there is fair treatment and that the regulation just made sense. Now, I move on to Fuller's internal morality of law. So you can see from this, this is prepared by one of the mainstream media outlets, Channel News Asia in Singapore, and it summarizes some of the rules. So the rules are actually quite funny in the detail. So if you look at the chart on the left, right, we was required to wear masks, but you're required to wear masks only, you know, you're not required to wear masks when you're actually exercising vigorously. So the rules became explained in this way. If you were brisk walking, then you could take off your mask. If you're climbing a hill, then you can take off a mask. If you're jogging, you can take off a mask. But if you're just strolling through the park, then you have to put on your mask. So there was some social media meme laughing at this, saying that if you are not wearing a mask, if you forget to wear a mask and you see an officer coming to check on you, to give you a penalty for not wearing a mask, then hurriedly just jog on the spot, you see, do some vigorous exercise, and then you'll be fine, because you're not supposed, I mean, you'll be okay because you don't have to wear a mask. So the rules were detailed in this manner. Now, given that the rules were so detailed, and I mean, they are so counterintuitive because they involve interruption into our day-to-day living, you can see how Fuller's requirements become extremely important. So take the requirement of publication. Now, if you want to contain a pandemic, you want to regulate people's behavior, Fuller thinks that law is law involves subjecting human conduct to governance by rules, right? So if you want to contain a pandemic, you can't just say that I will comply with the rule of law and publish in the government gazette. That's not enough. So it has to be quickly conveyed to people. And I thought that the way the rules were made known were quite creative. So for example, to stop people from going to the beaches, the car parks were closed. And then, you know, on all the chairs and so on, ensure that there was safe distancing on those public benches, certain parts that you're not supposed to sit on were taped, so that you know that you're not supposed to sit there. And then there were lots of signs in the park as well. And there was a reliance on social media influencers and all these, there are safe distancing ambassadors, walking around reminding people to keep a distance. So there was even a use of some I think, a robot moving around in the park, making the announcements to make sure that people kept their safe distance. Then another interesting requirement of Fuller is that law should not require the impossible. So, masks are required, but at some stage, we couldn't buy personal protection equipment at all. Masks were not available. So on the internet, unless you were willing to pay a super high price, the masks were not just available, not even online, not in the shops. So of course, the government then made the mask for us. So Singaporeans were given some masks, and we had little vending machines, all over, and we could get free masks just by using our identity cards. So that, if the law was such that we had to wear masks, at least, we could comply. So the laws must not require the impossible. And of course, Fuller suggests that law should not change too often. But I guess in a pandemic situation, this has to be compromised because of the evolving knowledge and to tailor the laws to people's behavior. And law should not be contradictory. That's another requirement. So during the whole April period last year, of course, April is also the time when businesses have their annual general meetings, and they were required to meet in person before the COVID. So the rules had to be changed just for the COVID period, that there had to be exemptions or meeting online and so on. And another important requirement of Fuller is that there should be congruence between official action and the rules as announced. So if you announce the rules, you must have the officers enforcing it. And I think this is linked to the point that the legal positivists make about how there should be use of sanctions, and there should be effective sanctions carried out. So this takes on a special significance during the pandemic, because as I said, we are not doing terribly evil things if we were to violate the laws. So it seems that we can forget and just, not wear a mask or stuff like that, or we can meet with people and we don't feel we're doing something bad because we're just assessing the risk differently, or we think that we're not infecting others, we're not sick, and so on and so forth. But you see, if some people comply, then others don't, then there's a great sense of unfairness that, I'm the one sacrificing, I'm the one being inconvenienced, but others are just doing whatever they want. So there would be a great sense of unfairness. So in social media, there were photos coming up, people were taking photos of people, and here is one photo that caused quite a stir. So this is quite a hip area, and people were just hanging out there, violating the rules, you see, and having drinks and so on. And when this photo was up, there was immediate enforcement because it was such a blatant disregard of the rules. And so there was the people were actually prosecuted, and they happened to be non-Singaporean, so they had to be, their work visas were terminated, and they were sent out of the country after paying a penalty as well. Okay, so the other issue that crops up, I guess, is in relation to, I don't know whether it's used in some of your countries as well, the contact tracing. So there's a lot of contact tracing in Singapore based on the apps that we were encouraged to use. And we can download these apps on our cell phone. So this is the one on my mobile phone. You can see that it looks like that. So it actually is updated version. So it actually tells you whether I've been vaccinated. I'm not vaccinated yet. And then it tells you that whether I have a COVID test result that is pending. So that's just for me to see. Nobody else sees it. And when I walk past others, because the Bluetooth is on, then it will send a signal and will exchange signals. So should I end up having COVID, or someone ends up having COVID, then there is some tracing of who I was near, for how long, and so on and so forth. Well, of course, this raises the issue of liberty of people. So there was a lady walking around, and when a fellow a person on the street told her, hey, you have to wear a mask, she started saying that, oh, I'm a sovereign, I don't have to comply with rules, and so on and so forth. So that caused that was in the news as well. Finally, I just want to talk about Dworkin's idea that we can interpret the laws even when there is a gap in the law. So we're not looking for a bad man's interpretation of law. We're not just looking to avoid sanctions, but you can comply with the spirit of the law. So this is what the Prime Minister of Singapore then said in one of the speeches, that, you know, he wanted us to comply with the spirit of the law, not just the letter of the rules. And I think that perhaps there were many people who were willing to do that. The streets were really empty. And I wanted to make sense a little bit of Dworkin's idea that even when there's a gap in the rule, we can make sense of the law and know what the spirit of the law is. So here I'm going to give an example that cropped up in my jurisprudence class. So before the schools were shut down and had to go online, some of the courses were taken online first. So my course was one of the courses that was taken online. We were given notice of a few weeks, you know, so suddenly for a few weeks, in a few weeks' time, we had to go online. We could no longer meet in person. And usually for every semester, I would buy my students food, you know, just to have a time of social bonding, you know, to just eat together as a class. So I was wondering whether I would buy them food. And I was thinking, if I bought them food, you know, what if they started to mingle over food? And this was at the start of COVID in February 2020. I was thinking that, hey, if they started to mingle over food, maybe the disease would be transmitted and so on and so forth. So of course, I was thinking about the new school rules that were coming up, and the school rules will not address the issue of food, because food is just not normally served in classes. But if I was thinking about complying with the spirit of the rules as a whole, not legal rules, but the school rules, what should I do? And I thought that, well, I mean, what is the purpose of chasing the classes online, you know, that we can't meet in person? Is to reduce footfall on campus, is to reduce the use of public transport, is to reduce the risk of transmission. And I thought that, well, I mean, over food, you know, it is possible that if we are eating over food, you know, we might be sharing the food and there might be a risk of transmission. So I decided that to comply with the letter of the school rules, you know, even though there was a gap in the school rules, I decided not to serve food, of course, to the disappointment of my students. And I think that was something I didn't regret. I mean, because in the end, just some weeks later, there was a dinner event, a dinner party that was held in some other public place, and that turned out to be quite a source of infections. So it turns out that it's possible to think in terms of complying with the letter, with the spirit of the laws rather than the letter of the laws. So I will just end by saying that sometimes Singapore is laughed at for having so many rules. You know, for example, we have a ban on chewing gum. We have a very clean city. We are known to have many rules and to have a clean country. But I was pleased that during this time, actually, people were willing to just comply with the rules for the sake of the common good, to actually suffer the personal inconveniences for the sake of the common good. So that has turned out quite good, in the sense that, of course, it requires a confluence of factors, but still, you know, today I could go out freely to have lunch, I mean, with a mask on, and taking out my mask only when I'm at the restaurant. But for that, I'm thankful. Okay, so I'm at the end of my presentation. Thanks for listening.
Oh, we very thanks, Ms. Hantan, for your presentation. Highly exciting. It makes me exciting because you make concrete the situation, some legal philosophical issues. You make highly concrete by Singapore legislation. Thank you very much. And then in the 7th session, I very pleasure to present Mr. Tonel from Brazil, Rodrigo Tonel from Brazil. We are looking forward to his speech. Its title, The Access to Health During the Pandemic of COVID-19 in Brazil, an approach through the theory of necropolitics. He informed us about necropolitics as well. Yes. Mr. Tonel.
All right. So my name is Rodrigo Tonel. I live here in South Brazil, and I come from the Regional University of the Northwest of the state of Rio Grande do Sul, most known as Unijuí. And just to give you a brief biography myself, I'm a doctorate student by the graduate program of Law and Human Rights of the referred university here in Brazil. And well, first of all, I'd like to say that it's been an honor and a privilege for me to be participating of this event with so much knowledge and contributions from all different parts of the world. And I also would like to thank the organizing committee for their support and for their kindness as well. But I mean, before introducing the main topic of my discussion, I'd like to make a quotation from the book Be Very Afraid, written by the American sociologist Robert Yuthnow, where he states the right thing in his introduction. He states, for more than 6 decades, humankind has lived with the knowledge that it could be the agent of its own annihilation. We are constantly reminded of crises, large and small, present and anticipated. The truth is that serious perils to the existence of humanity have become a fact of contemporary life. The threat of mass death, environmental devastation, and even human extinction is an alarming reality. So of course, he's basically trying to communicate that throughout history, man has never been faced with so much issues such as environmental devastation, terrorism, pandemics, and nuclear annihilation as compared to contemporaneity. And with that being said, let's jump right into the topic. And now the issue I'm about to discuss is related to one of these perils, which is pandemic. The issue of pandemics, specifically the current pandemic of COVID-19 here in Brazil and its relationship with the theory of necropolitics, as well as the violation of the right to health and the proposals given by the political leaders with a necropolitical perspective. In other words, the criteria that dictates who lives and who dies. In this case, who breathes and who suffocates. And among the goals of this investigation, I seek to identify which profiles of human beings are being protected or covered by the resource allocation protocols throughout the Brazilian states, and who are the ones that are threatened or excluded from those protocols. In this sense, the methodology adopted in this study is based on the hypothetical deductive method, and it basically means a short review of the theory of necropolitics, a concept primarily elaborated by the Cameroonian philosopher Achille Mbembe. And so, well, I believe everybody knows that the coronavirus manifests itself and essentially compromises the respiratory system. In the most severe cases, patients need certain mechanical equipment in order to help them breathe, in order to help them keeping them alive, such as ventilators, for example. In addition, they need to be isolated in ICU beds or ICU rooms. Meanwhile, given the fact of the quick spread of this new virus and the consequent contamination of populations all around the world, health systems are getting overcrowded with patients presenting severe symptoms from the COVID-19, needing urgent treatment and hospitalization in ICU beds. In other words, the demands have been suppressing the usual hospital's capacities. Thus, health professionals and political leaders have been adopting resource allocation protocols against the coronavirus, making ventilators and ICU beds available to certain individuals at the expense of others, under a utilitarian logic of maximizing resources, disrespecting this sense in this context and violating constitutional and bioethical principles. It's possible to observe that although shortages of all goods and services may lead to death, in most cases, it will be the combined effect of a variety of shortages that will result in worse outcomes. Mechanical ventilation is different. When patients' breathing deteriorates to the point that they need a ventilator, there is typically only a limited window during which they can be saved. And when the machine is withdrawn from patients who are fully ventilator dependent, they will usually die within a minute. Unlike decisions regarding other forms of life-sustaining treatment, the decision about initiating or terminating mechanical ventilation is often truly a life or death choice. So that's very worrying fact. Now, the Brazilian Association of Intensive Care, along with the Brazilian Association of Emergency Medicine and the National Academy of Palliative Care here in our country, launched a protocol for allocating resources during the COVID-19 pandemic. And they established that the most relevant bioethical criteria, namely the severity of the case and the highest degree of survival, and as well the capacity of the patient. Furthermore, the referred document advocates the predominance that the most solid principles is that of prioritizing patients with better chances of benefit and with higher expectations of survival. And I'm going to give you more examples about the protocols and the ideas and the criteria discussed in those proposals. Now, some protocols have been adopting the so-called SOFA, a sequential organ failure assessment. That is a scoring system that takes into account when calculating a set of indicators despite the patient's vitality, a score ranging from 1 to 4. That's the punctuation they established. Thus, for example, the higher the score and the result calculated in that system, this means that the patient has lower chances of survival. And another bioethical triage criterion that has been taken into account is the long-term survival. This means that the idea of saving more years of life. Thus, the calculation is based on the assessment or verification of severe comorbidity with an expected survival of less than 1 year. If this happens, 3 points are added to the calculation. It takes into account, of course, the age of the patient. Regarding the patient's capacity, and here's a very interesting thing, the calculation is based on the Functional Performance Scale, most known as ECOG. And this abbreviation simply means Eastern Cooperative Oncologic Group, an instrument that seeks to quantify the physical functional capacity of the patients for independence and self-care. In other words, the capacity for work, the capacity of taking care of himself. This way, the worse the patient's performance status, the lower the functional capacities, and consequently, it is assumed that less results will be obtained during the treatment. In this stratification, adopted can vary between 0 to 4 points. And finally, I like to quote an author here in Brazil. Her name is von der Weid, and she emphasizes that in light of the context of all those protocols, in some of the Brazilian states, instruments for the assessment of the patient's functionality have been already incorporated, such as the Karnofsky Performance Status, also known as KPS, a system that simply quantifies physical functional capacity and the capacity for independence and self-care. And that is a worrying fact because of the adoption of these instruments in order to select who will have the hospitalization priority and who will be excluded. Therefore, it is an indication that constitutes an indirect threat with people with disabilities, older people, and among many other vulnerable groups. And just to give you one more example, is the approval of the regulatory protocol for COVID-19 cases for the highly complex intensive care units in the state of Rio Grande do Sul. By the way, that's the state where I live, where one of the criteria that might assist the patient's classification of priority is the age group with less than or equal to 75 years old. By the argument, now listen to this, the argument that given the circumstances of the pandemic, the allocation of resources should be aimed at patients who are more likely to survive. By this reason, all patient series published so far identify the age group as a reliable predictor of higher mortality. Now, in one side of the fence, it is possible to realize that it sounds plausible, the argument. And also it is very difficult in the times of crisis to select individuals because the numbers of patients are huge compared to the number of equipment available, and there isn't enough equipment available to everyone. Now, at the other hand, it sounds like a discriminatory argument But let's continue. The Brazilian Federal Constitution from 1988 in its Article 6 and 196 establishes that health is a fundamental social right, and therefore the state has the duty to implement it, and its access is equal and universal to everyone who needs it. Now, however, due to the current pandemic scenario and the shortages of equipment, there has been a failure to comply with such precepts. That means the instant replacement of constitutional rights and constitutional articles and bioethical principles and even human rights by a utilitarian logic, notwithstanding the priority criteria for the access of ICU beds and ventilators and the promoting selectivity of certain bodies that has been considered worthy of living and those that should be left and are excluded. In other words, the material extermination of certain bodies and populations deemed incapable and vulnerable. In addition to the visible denial and violation of the fundamental human right to health, precisely the fundamental human right to health. Now, in spite of all these events, on the other hand, the Brazilian Society of Bioethics postulates that the constitutional principles of human dignity and social solidarity, as well as human rights and bioethical principles, should be respected, highlighting the importance and urgency to invest more resources in the public health system, hiring more health professionals, and guaranteeing equal access to health services to patients at all levels of care. This recommendation also points out to the observance of the principle of equity and access to health services within the context of the pandemics, especially for those groups considered to be vulnerable, aiming to avoid possible discrimination. And that is the dichotomy of the economical issue over human lives. Political leaders, they're trying to preserve the economy at all costs, even if that means human lives. But even it is important to highlight an important aspect. It is appropriate that the only priority exception to access to equipment necessary for treatment against the COVID-19 are health professionals who work in the front lines. And of course, that's a very reasonable argument, and that should be the only exception because of their irreplaceable knowledge and training in order to cope with the virus. Nonetheless, another antagonism that deserves to be taken into account is the fact that 75% of the Brazilian population depends exclusively on the public health system, which represents only 44% of the ICU beds available in the country. The other 25% of the population, they can afford to a private health system. And in this private health system, it is the availability of ICU beds is related to like 55%. So the number of ICU beds in the private health system is higher than in the public system. In this way, it is opportune to address the idea of necropolitics, a term or a theory that refers to a contemporary forms to subjugate life to the power of death, profoundly reconfigure relationships between resistance, sacrifice, and terror. Those are the words of Achille Mbembe. Now, when it comes to the pandemic, all this pandemic issue, discussions regarding the allocation of resources during the COVID-19 pandemic in Brazil, ranging from the refusal or denial of respiratory mechanisms and the access of ICU beds in detriment to the elderly and people with disability, justified by a neoliberal rationality associated with the necropolitics, literally sacrificing human lives. That's the idea of admissible sacrifice, and considering that the functional contribution of these groups for production and consumption is no longer of the interest of the economic system. Now, in this context, another aspect that deserves to be highlighted concerns to the scientific denialism, expressively in the disregard or rejection of analysis and scientifically proven results in favor of dubious ideas, fake news, false information, which has been adopted in the speeches of some Brazilian governments. For example, our president, he said that the coronavirus would be compared to a simple flu and that the population shouldn't be worrying about it too much. Now, they're denying the severity of the pandemic issue. Undoubtedly, the new coronavirus has caused devastation all around the world, leading to an overload on health systems and producing lots of deaths. However, in the Brazilian scenario, more aggressive and dangerous than the virus itself are the responses orchestrated by political leaders. The scientific denialism, the neoliberal rationality that transposes the economy over human lives, the necropolitics on the resource allocation protocols, disrespecting and violating fundamental social rights as well constitutional rights. Therefore, it is indisputable the claim that health is an integral part of the quality of life in order to have a dignified life. But in order to enjoy a dignified life, it must not be forgotten that for its realization, for its fruition, the state must provide means so that the population can, for example, have access to medications, health services, equipment, and promoting decent living conditions for the general population. Now, of course, I am leading to my final considerations, sustaining that my study is very inconclusive. However, I'd like to let some remaining questions as a way of ending my presentation. And here it goes. It remains imperative, therefore, to maintain a minimum health system that can save people from death, not only at the present moment, as it is very likely that this will not be the last pandemic that humanity will experience, and the prognosis warns against the possibility of new and future pandemics. If this hypothesis becomes a reality in an indeterminate future, some reflective questions must be raised. And those are, will the Brazilian political leaders once again become inactive? Will the Brazilian public health system continue to survive in this rhythm of precariousness in the public investments? And how long will Brazil continue to neglect its public health system in times of health crisis like the one currently occurring? Will necropolitics endure dictating who lives and who dies? And how long will the economy be more important than human lives? Those are very reflexive questions. And with all that being said, I'd like to thank you one more time for your kind attention and for having me on board. Hope we can have a great discussion after the break. Thank you all.
Oh, yes. We thanks Mr. Tonel. His speech actually indicated the most important issue, namely rights of life and related access to health system, how related access to health system and right of life. He summarized all the problems we confront during the pandemics, and I questioned maybe it might be justifiable by the utilitarian point of view, but even Hobbesian point of view, why we found the sovereign and state? Answer is protect to life, right of life. Thanks a lot. Yes, we now finished all four participants represented his and her speech. And now we can get questions. Time to questions and discussion. Yes. Is there any question to our guest participants? I think Professor Uygur, there's no any questions.
Yes, I couldn't see also. There is no question. Yeah. Okay. What can we do? Do you have any comment? No. Yes.
Excuse me if I may.
Helga. Yeah.
Hi.
Hi.
Just a comment for Professor Seow-Hon. I wish I'm not pronouncing it so terrible. Well, I find your presentation very interesting and very inspiring. I wonder, for example, when you explain that in Singapore, for example, you have the common law kind of rules. Well, I'm not very familiar with it. I mean, from Argentina, we are at the continental system. But for example, when you talked about some requirements, like being possible to accomplish, but also not overchanging or not overruling, I was wondering that how can you articulate, for example, that a rule comes in force, some statutory law, because you need to act fast, but also that the society has to agree with that statute, with that law. So how is it easy to coordinate that people are behaving according to law and the statutory law? Because when you are not used to have a rule that comes in force and provides you an obligation, but you act according to common law. So has it been easy, or have there been many problems about that? How did it work actually? Thank you very much.
Okay, thanks for the question. I appreciate it. Just to clarify, we are a common law system, but we have lots of statutes. So 300 over chapters or statutes. So we are used to our criminal law, for example, is contained in statutes. Road Traffic Act, for example, is contained in statutes as well. So we're used to statutes, but I guess here we're dealing with the pace and the detail of the regulation. So for example, to find out whether my dog could go to the vet, I had to Google and find out. So I guess if we need some specialized services, we'll end up having to Google, or we'll call up our friends to ask, or, you know, fellow dog owners will be sending the updated regulations to one another. Now, as for the more day-to-day stuff, you know, go out, how many people do you see? I found that being a law professor, I had friends who were not legally trained, who were contacting me by text and asking me, you know, whether they could do this or that. And sometimes I didn't know the answer, so I would have to check. So I guess in terms of communication of the new rules as they evolve, if it involved public spaces, like the use and usage of facilities in the parks and all that, you had lots of officers standing there, and they I mean, you could see they had some lanyard and some tag that showed that they were officers. So they would go around telling people not to do this or that. So it's not as if I don't suppose that you know, it's just about imposition of penalty straight away, but there's really an attempt to communicate the new rules. And then the mainstream media, the newspapers, instead of my usual, I mean, I still subscribe to a physical copy of the newspaper, a hard copy, and instead of the normal first page, we have a new cover on it with these cartoons, you see, like the one I've showed you, telling people in I mean, in an easy way, with just the cartoons, what you're supposed to do, reminding you what to do or what not to do. And then even now, with regards to vaccination and getting people on board on our TV, there are lots of commercials going on, and there are all these local actresses and actors, you know, sharing a little more so as to communicate to the seniors. I mean, it's not so much propaganda, but really communicating to the seniors in a way that they understand. So telling them about what they can do to get the vaccine, addressing some of their concerns and so on. So the use of all these different channels. So it's not so much about imposing a penalty, but really, I think you can see Lon Fuller's theory about governing human conduct through rules are really coming into play here. That, you know, it's all about changing our behavior by communicating to us rather than just imposing penalties. Thanks for your question.
Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you all for valuable contributors. And now we close. We time to close. It's time to close 7th session of our Congress. Okay, I wish healthy days to everyone. Keep healthy. Thank you very much.
Thank you
Our
very much.
audience.
Thank you very much, Professor Metin. We will meet at 6:30 for discussion panel.
30 or quarter?
6:30 we announced that.
Okay.
Okay. Now until that time we will give a break. We will meet at 6:30.
Thank you.